Hi, my name's Kim. I'm a licensed and nationally certified East Asian medical provider and a Taoist practitioner. I have wanted to talk about this potential coincidental correlation of the release of new technology and this outbreak ever since this outbreak happened in November in 2021. The new technology is the mRNA vaccines, the COVID vaccines. These vaccines gain their approval through the FDA, and maybe there's some opportunity to improve this process after approval because we've approved things like plastics, like BPA, like PFAS, nonylphenols, Roundup Ready crops, Oxycontin. Once these products are out there, it takes a whole lot of tragedy, deaths, illness, shattered families, ruined livelihoods, and years of legal battle to undo the damage. I want to give a disclaimer because in the last 2 years, I have seen a real shift in how our agencies are protecting us. But, let's be real. Corporations have had decades to buy their way into our federal, administrative, legislative, and judicial branches, creating policies that push agencies to approve their new technology without ever understanding the full impact of these products on people and the environment. And it's become pretty evident through legal battles that the companies making these products knew the risk but kept it under wraps. Right now, the corporations and the CEOs, they have no liability. And to make matters worse, the labs the corporations hire to test the products for the FDA have been churning out dodgy data since 1974. At least since 1974, it's clearly documented. And I think it's fair to start looking at these new mRNA technology with its nanoparticles and wonder if it is having an impact on our environment and ourselves that could be catastrophic. We're going to look at the science and look at what happened to see if there are correlations. So in 2021, we had an avian flu outbreak. Do you remember that? I do, because it occurred a year after the mRNA vaccines had been released. I know some people say correlation does not equal causation, and then others say there's no such thing as coincidence. There is mounting evidence leading towards causation. The avian flu, it caught my attention because, of how deadly it was. And according to Israel officials, the first outbreak in Israel, the current outbreak is different because it's causing massive mortality rates among infected birds. And the Environmental Protection Minister, Tamir Zandberg, tweeted in December of 2021 that this outbreak of H5N1 bird flu, it's the worst blow to wildlife in Israel's history, and that the full extent of its damage is still unclear. What's interesting to note is that this outbreak that was so incredibly deadly, more deadly than any other avian flu before its time, was killing 20% of their wild crane population. So this bird flu in November of 2021 was different. And everyone knew it when they saw it. 2 changes had happened with this bird or this avian flu in 2021. First, this H5N1 avian flu became more deadly than it ever had been. And second, the outbreaks of avian flu became continuous. So it's more deadly, it's lasting longer. And this was really confusing because we had already learned from the influenza virus, the viruses don't migrate up the virulence ladder. They actually migrate down, becoming less lethal. And the theory from the scientists and based on history is that life wants to live, and killing your environment, so killing your host, is not a good survival strategy. Viruses mutate down and become less lethal. What had changed that this bird flu or this avian flu was mutating up the lethal ladder? Well, the pandemic hit in December of 2020, and Israel was one of the first countries to adopt mass vaccination campaigns. So by February 2021, 9 months before the November 2021 outbreak in birds, 90% of Israelis over 60 had received at least one dose of the Pfizer vaccine. These are wild migrating cranes. And so another country in the same region, right across the Mediterranean Sea, was Italy. And Italy was one of the first European countries to have a really bad COVID outbreak. Italy initiated a mass immunization campaign, making it mandatory that all workers over the age of 50 must have a vaccine. So by October 2021, a month before this avian flu outbreak in Israel, 80% of Italy's population, 80% over the age of 12, had been double vaccinated. Okay, you're saying, well, that's really interesting, but how do we get from the jabs to the cranes? Well, the outbreak happens in Israel in November when the cranes are migrating from Russia. And these cranes actually do migrate through Italy. So because of the timing of the outbreak and where the outbreak was happening, I thought there had to be a connection with the jabs. But it wasn't until July 2023 when Claire Craig released her book, Expired COVID, The Untold Story. It's really a good book on some of the stories that we were told to believe in and some of the science. And here was a scientific researcher who actually started looking at some of the reasons things may have happened the way they did. I think one of the most interesting parts of her work is the discussion on transmission. Most of our medical ideation or most of our medical theory on transmission is based on bacterias. Yet what happened with COVID and the jabs was a whole new thing that our medicine has never had to confront before. What was different is we were working with things that were smaller than anything we had worked with in the past. Our current Western medical system is primarily geared towards tackling larger threats like bacteria. They often struggle to address smaller scale issues. So a virus is 1,000 times smaller than a bacteria. But a nanoparticle is 1,000 times smaller than a virus. So Western medicine is fairly ineffective at treating viruses. If Western medicine has limited resources to address viruses, then it has absolutely nothing to address nanoparticles. And even if our current medical system could address nanoparticles, their size implies that they operate under different physical laws than larger particles. So here it is. Claire Craig was able to address some of these differences in physics in her book, Expired COVID, The Untold Story. What she found was that due to the size of the particles being shed from the COVID-19 shots, we were now talking about microbacteria in the environment, nanoparticles, spike proteins, microviruses. And she found that these things don't fall to the ground. They actually stay airborne. So these airborne particles, they can enter the body through the nose, through the mouth, through the mucous membranes. They don't have to be ingested. And we have these particles and they're in the air, making the birds the first contact with the particles shedded after the shots. There is actually research that people shed the vaccines after getting the vaccines, but there's also another part of this. Many of the doctors and medical research professionals have stated that mRNA shots, they don't fit into the definition of vaccines as they're not created from a virus. These shots, they modify our messenger RNA and they use this modified messenger RNA to tell our body to create products that it wouldn't otherwise produce. So that aligns these shots more with gene therapy. Way back before the pandemic in 2015, the FDA identified shedding as a risk of all gene therapy medications and developed guidance on testing for shedding in new products. So the industry guidance paper is called, and once again, it's this really big long name that can just put you to sleep. Design and analysis of shedding studies for virus or bacteria-based gene therapy and oncolytic products. Here's the kicker. The FDA indicates that COVID shots are not gene therapy because the FDA has labeled them as vaccines and not gene therapy. And because they have this different label for the shots, the guidance doesn't apply. Okay, from an administrative perspective, I get that. But what we also get is that the issue isn't if these shots shed. There's enough evidence that they do. And if you're sensitive before 2024, even going into a grocery store could be a problem for you. So one of the things that Claire Craig hypothesized, it'd be great if we did some science on this, right? But she hypothesized that one of the ways that the avian flu mutated into birds was that they came in contact with the spike protein or the nanoparticles in the air. And if birds were traveling or in or exposed to large populations of recently vaccinated individuals like Italy and Israel, well, then their probability of being exposed was much higher. Okay? So there's a couple more things. So that's one hypothesis. It's in the air. And that hypothesis is going to hold for quite a few things. But something else happened in Israel. In November of 2021, a chicken farm in Israel had an outbreak of avian flu. And it wasn't just one. There's a few chicken farms that had outbreaks and they didn't report it to authorities. Now, Israel feeds migrating cranes so they don't feed on the adjacent farmer fields. That's, I was really surprised to hear that because, that's something we could do here in the United States too, right? But corn from this infected farm, this farm that had avian flu from their chickens, was transported to the reserve where the cranes were wintering, and it was fed to the cranes. When the authorities were finally notified of the outbreak at the farm that fed the cranes this feed, in one of the pens, out of 2,000 chickens, only 70 birds were left. So the question becomes, okay, how did these chickens get this more virulent form of the avian flu? Well, there's a couple things. One of the things that was really interesting is that this is a factory farm. So there are thousands of chickens in here. And this factory farm, being that they had this outbreak, that they didn't notify authorities, that they spread it into the wild bird population, they became a bit of a poster child for the problems with factory farms. And I think I was amazed to see, like in the United States, we know everything's a factory farm and we have a problem with it, but we don't ever see anything on the news about it. We don't see anything in our paper or on our social media about it. But in Israel, they're talking about it. And in other countries, they were talking about it. And when these cranes became sick and they found that it came from a factory farm that wasn't following the rules, it really highlighted, again, what they see as a problem with factory farming. So how did these chickens get this more virulent strain? Well, we go back to Claire Craig's hypothesis on transmission, and we'll see in later episodes that the transmission hypothesis of hers is accurate. But airborne particles infect the chickens, and there was a September 2023 study. The question is, can chickens be the intermediary between SARS-CoV-2 and humans? And they found early on that they were susceptible to strains of SARS-CoV-2. The question becomes now, they do think that they have a potential to be an intermediate host and become infected with any of the mutated strains. The question becomes, we're looking at SARS-CoV-2. We've never assessed the jabs for what they're shedding into the environment, and it looks like they're shedding something completely different than what we're used to seeing. We're hearing a lot more about microbacteria suddenly. We're seeing a lot about strange clotting issues that are not found on exams, or people suddenly dying, especially teenagers suddenly dying, and nothing shows up in our exams. So the question becomes, are chickens more susceptible to whatever that is? Now, I brought up the issue of Israel and their population density because another thing in this report is they said that they thought it had to deal with high density situations. So that, like we saw earlier in COVID where population density made a difference, they were thinking the same thing in chickens. And whether that's true now or not, who knows? But what was important about this study is it did show that chickens can be an intermediate vector. Okay, so what does all that mean? So we have this theory that these particles, they don't fall to the ground like it was originally thought. They stay airborne because they are so much smaller than we had ever imagined. They're lighter than air. And so they stay airborne, and they can go through the mouth, they can go through the mucosae. There's a lot of discussion on what nanoparticles can go through. And so they can go through a lot of things. And they find that infected workers infect farm animals and infect zoo animals. So there was probably somebody who had either been recently vaccinated or had been recently infected, came into the farm in contact with the chickens and spread this to the chickens. Now, this is a more virulent form of H5N1 avian influenza. So the question is, can you have dual infections? And what we're finding is that, yeah, you can have this dual kind of infection going on in people. The infection from COVID-19 is almost like this baseline immune system destruction, allowing infections that are usually not very lethal to become suddenly much more lethal. And maybe this H5N1 is one of those examples. We'd have to see, but it's a hypothesis. One of the things I was looking at somebody helping me understand the size differential. So if we thought of bacteria as the size of a van, in compared to a virus, then we consider a virus would be the size of a suitcase. So that gives you a really good idea of just how much size differential there is. So if a bacteria is a van, a virus is the size of a suitcase. But then think about that. This virus is the size of a suitcase. Well, then a nanoparticle must be the size of an earring box inside the suitcase. Okay, so that seems to be the start of it. That seems to be the start of this really virulent avian flu getting into our wild bird populations. I do think this avian flu is going to be a big problem for us. And if you watch my channel, I do a lot of the East Asian esoteric stuff, like the I Ching, like the forecasting. And from those forecasts, it looks like 2029 will have another pandemic that's going to be much more virulent. And I think this avian flu is going to be the reason that it happens. But if we don't start to understand why it happened right now, the same thing that's happening right now where nothing's getting addressed with the potential risk to 30% of our population of taking these vaccines, none of that's going to get addressed again. So So I think it's worthwhile just to kind of talk about this and, think about what's the science saying? And if the science is saying that, then is it reasonable if it happened this way? And if it happened this way, what was the root cause? And if that's the root cause, do we need to rethink what we're doing? And that's really the whole point of this is, we've approved a lot of things and we found out later on that they had a very damaging impact on the environment. And maybe we need to start addressing that now, because this looks like it could have a very critical impact on not just our environment, but on us.